quite a while is taking you through a project that we're going to be working on together with support from our colleagues at UHI Archaeology and also Fran from the Cathedral and other people who are going to be involved, and hopefully many of your good selves as well. So my name's Hayley, I'm the Secretary of Orkney Archaeology Society. I'm not really going to be speaking very much tonight, apart from we'll probably come in at the end if you've got any questions about how the project is going to work. But what I would just start off by saying is that this isn't a training event. So you're not going to leave the next sort of hour or so by being able to go out and take part in the project. So obviously for those of you that have signed up to be involved in the project, that training is yet to come. And we'll cover that a little bit towards the end of this, but more in terms of expectations rather than straying into that territory too much. But what tonight's kind of almost a launch meeting, but in many ways we launched this when we released the publicity, and we've had a phenomenal amount of publicity on this, which has been absolutely fantastic and really good to get that, because there's been a huge amount of interest in this project. But what I would just start off by saying is this project actually started, I think, pretty much nearly 2 years ago, and that was the time we had the first conversation where Fran got in touch with the Archaeology Society and also with Antonia at UHI and kind of said, we think this might be a good idea to do a project to record the graffiti in the cathedral. What do you think? Are you up for it? And of course, we were all really up for it. But it takes a long time from sort of project idea to funding to organisation to get to this point. So I think it's fair to say that we're all really excited to be basically a week away from the first lot of training. But it is also something that seems to have come around really quickly. Once we've got the funding and the approval, it's kind of been a bit of a headlong rush, really. So bear with us as we kind of go through the first sort of section of this. But what we're going to be doing this evening is Fran's going to be taking you through a very short history of St Magnus Cathedral, and then Antonia is going to take you through more around kind of graffiti in general and recording and some of the kind of really interesting things that come along with that. So that's mainly the meat of this. It's the kind of stuff that we won't be able to cover in the training, but it gives you really useful context and background to what's going to be going on. So I'll pass over to Fran now. We'll take the lights down so you can see the slides. And then at the end of that, if you've got questions and it goes into process, how's it going to run back training, we'll kind of cover that at the end if we can. And of course we do have a raffle, so you'll be pleased to know we'll be putting the raffle at the end. So I'll pass you on to Fran and I'll sort the lights out. Okay?
Very much.
Thank you.
Right. Now, this is one of these remits where I basically fill the time available between, 15 minutes and however many hours you want of the history of the cathedral. But the very short history of St Magnus Cathedral was first put together for an event in 2017, which was run, it was the year that we did the Year of Magnus 900, which was spectacularly successful in all sorts of ways, and there was so much community involvement. It was wonderful. But one of the things that happened in that year was we had a visit that was organised by the Catholic Diocese of Aberdeen, who very much still recognised Magnus as a saint and wanted to pay their respects accordingly. And they had bishops from all over the place and archbishops and goodness knows what else. And they asked me to do a talk about the history of the cathedral, and it was actually in here, and it was more or less this talk, and it really was a very brief history. So, why here? Why was the cathedral built in Kirkwall? Well, there are lots of possibilities. One was that Kirkwall was developing and growing in importance. The seat of the power before that in Orkney had been up in Bursey, the northwest of Orkney mainland. Kirkwall was growing as importance as a good strategic position, sea to the north, sea to the south. But in terms of St Magnus himself, it's said in one of the versions of the Orkneyinga saga that a man in Westry called Gunny had a dream where St Magnus appeared to him in a vision and demanded that his body be taken to Kirkwall. And Gunny ignored this, and then St Magnus appeared to him in another dream. And as the saga says, he was quite angry. So when you're confronted by an angry and grumpy Magnus demanding for his bones to be moved, well, who's going to say no to that? It is possible too that the cathedral is built on a site that was significant before the cathedral was there. A lot of old churches are built on the site of even older churches. We don't necessarily think that's the case, but it might have been a site that was important to pre-Christian belief systems. So there might have been something significant about that site. So these are some of the suggestions as to why the cathedral was built where it was in Kirkwall. Now, the building wasn't all built in one go. The core of it was started in the early 12th century. If you look at the picture, you can see the green section in the middle, which is the crossing, the choir area, the two transepts, and the very first part of the nave. Started in 1137. There was enough of it to be consecrated by about 1150, up and running as a cathedral within 15 years, which is pretty good. Only a bit of it had a roof, but that's fine. The Shrine of Magnus was installed, body was and it was opened up as a cathedral, as a site of pilgrimage. And then the rest of it followed thereafter. I think in some ways it was a bit of a self-funding project, because when the pilgrims started to arrive, they brought money with them. And as the years went by with successive, dynamic bishops and more resources, it grew and it grew. And certainly one of the big extensions was the bit at the east end, the bit that's in purple at the top there, which was around about the early 13th century. So it just kind of grew and grew as the years went on. But of course its foundation was very much to do with Ronald, the Earl of Orkney, the nephew of St Magnus. It was his project to start with. And the vision that he had was to build the most impressive and the most important building in the whole of Orkney. And here we are, nearly 900 years later, and it still is the most impressive and the most important building in Orkney. Feel free to argue, I know I'm right. But that's a vision, isn't it? To have that length of foresight, to know that what he was doing was going to be a thing of such importance. And the cathedral was not built as a parish church. It wasn't built for local people to go on a Sunday, and pray or sing a hymn or whatever they did. It was built as a site of pilgrimage. It was built to house the shrine of a saint. Now, this is not a picture of the shrine of St Magnus. This is actually the shrine of the Confessor in Westminster Abbey. But it's evidence that we have that suggests that the shrine of St Magnus was a very grand affair, possibly one of these tall on stilts jobs with the bones somewhere up here, so that you could actually get inside it. You could actually get underneath it and be as close as you possibly could physically to the bones of the saint, which is where all the people wanted to be. So there are little bits of evidence to suggest it was very rich, it was very ornate, it had bits of gold, it had precious stones on it. Big fancy thing, and the pilgrims would have come flocking. And indeed they did. They came from all over Northern Europe, came from Scotland, they came from Ireland, they came from Norway, they came from across the sea. And he was very, very popular. And he was joined by Ronald as a saint in 1192, and Ronald was also created a saint. And so there would have been a double shrine, double spiritual whammy, two saints side by side. Even more, bang for your buck. It's a really, it's a really good thing to do. A really good boost for the economy and for the spiritual well-being of a place to have two saints. So a double shrine, a founding saint and a patron saint. And that puts us in the top trumps of cathedrals. There's no doubt about that. Now, the cathedral came into the care or became the property of local people in 1486, and King James III granted it as a gift. It was kind of partly a gift and partly a bit of a bribe as well, I think, to kind of get it finished. And it was a very, once it had got to the size it was, and it was very busy, and people came, and a site of pilgrimage, and they produced little crosses for everybody to buy. And then, 1560, the Reformation happened. Now, I could talk for a very long time about the Reformation, don't worry. I won't. The lady we're looking at here is Mary of Guise. She was the regent of Scotland up until 1560. She was the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and she was an exceptionally devout Catholic. She was the regent of Scotland in lieu of her daughter Mary, who was busy being Queen of France. And Mary of Guise, knew about all the changes that were happening in Europe with the Reformed Church, and of course in England, the Church had reformed decades before. But she held back the tide as long as she could, and was, recorded as saying, Scotland becomes a Protestant country over my dead body. and she died in 1560, and Scotland became Protestant country. And so the reason I've got a picture of Mary of Guise is I was presenting this to a room full of Catholic bishops. I thought they'd rather see a picture of her than John Knox. The Reformation would have had an absolutely, remarkable effect on the life of St Magnus Cathedral. It was one of only 2 cathedrals in Scotland that survived the Reformation. One of 2, the other one being Glasgow Cathedral. Now, that's quite, I think, a remarkable thing. Every other cathedral in Scotland was utterly destroyed. Some of them have been rebuilt since. Some of them are still magnificent ruins. I was at university in St Andrews, which has a gorgeous ruin of a cathedral. It was the biggest in Scotland at one time, and it held the shrine of St Andrew, one of the apostles. But it is that. It's a magnificent ruin. But St Magnus Cathedral was not destroyed. However, there were some very, very dramatic changes. First of all, the shrine of the saint was removed. So it took away its entire raison d'etre. That's what the cathedral was built for. This is what it did. This is, we've got the shrine of a saint that's a site of pilgrimage. Suddenly, all that is gone, and the whole reason for the cathedral existing just disappears. It would have been a dramatic change inside, the removal of the shrine, but also the way that it looked. We don't really know for sure what the cathedral looked like prior to the Reformation, but we can look at other sources that we have. We can also look to other places where they didn't have a Reformation, like France, still a Catholic country. You can look at their churches and cathedrals and see how they're laid out. So we're pretty sure there would have been a lot of painted surfaces, a lot of very bright colours, a lot of gilding. There would also have been a lot more going on than there is as it is presently. There would have been lots of little side altars. There probably would have been things like chantry chapels that were endowed by local people or families to say prayers for the dead. There would have been a whole process of approaching the shrine. You didn't just kind of rock up and have a look. There would have been a whole process for a pilgrim to go through before they get anywhere near. So it seems that a lot of the fixtures and fittings would have been taken away. Any coloured glass, anything musical, any organs, things like that. Anything that was decorative or pictorial would almost certainly have been removed. So it would have looked very, very different to the way it looks now, but it would have looked very different to the way it was before the Reformation. So we've lost an awful lot. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the theology and how you feel about this, you can't help but regret a little bit the destruction of the thing, the beauty of the place. And it is beautiful now, there's no doubt about that, but it would have been beautiful in a different way before the Reformation. We know from the records that Cromwell's troops certainly did come to Orkney in the 17th century. A few of them stayed and made their homes here. And it seems that Cromwell's troops also took a fancy to the cathedral and used it for their own purposes. One of the bits of local lore is that they used these iron rings to tie up their horses. It's a nice story. But it does seem that they did use the cathedral, and they did not, as they quite often did with churches, burn it to the ground. They did also commit some acts of destruction. Most notably, the tomb of Thomas Tulloch, which had survived the Reformation, was smashed up. If you want to see bits of it, they've got them in the Orkney Museum. But that magnificent tomb once stood in St Magnus Cathedral. So what the Reformation started, Cromwell's troops pretty much kind of finished off. In the years that followed, the cathedral wasn't unused. The centre of it, the choir area, had been converted into a parish church, and it was used for regular worship. But I think it would be fair to say it wasn't wholly looked after well. It was in a little bit of a state of neglect. There was a time in the middle of the 19th century when it was taken over by the government, who decided that they would take it over as a historic property and carry out restoration and reparation, which they did. And, it didn't seem as if there was a huge fight put up by the Kirkwall Town Council at the time. And then the government moved in, the congregation was removed for a few years, and a lot of things were done. All the burials were removed from the nave, the big gravestones were taken, put against the walls, and so on. Various bits repaired, various bits replaced, worked on the roof. And after a few years, Kirkwall Town Council said, "Oh, we've found the royal charter, by the way, that says the cathedral belongs to us. Can we have it back now?" just after all that work had been done and all the money had been spent by somebody else. So some work was done in the 19th century, and the reinstatement of local control led to a kind of renewed pride, I think, in ownership of the cathedral and its history. And that really was followed by a very, very significant event. In the early 20th century, George Toms, Sheriff of Orkney and Shetland, died and left a massive legacy, a huge bequest for the restoration of St Magnus Cathedral, which was not actually greeted with universal support. There was a lot of letters to the paper and complaints saying we don't want the cathedral messed about with, and there's nothing wrong with it, and we're looking after it absolutely fine. But the money was there, and the cathedral was completely restored between 1913 and 1930. New spire was put on, new floors, new windows, all the stonework cleaned. And the way we see it now today, and the way that we all love it so much, is very much a product of the early 20th century. And that, you know, we love it the way it is, but it's not all, it's only looked like this for about 100 years. And part of the restoration, do you know, we have so many significant anniversaries coming up this year. We've got the 70th anniversary of the start of the Second World War. We've got the 100th anniversary of the scuttling of the German fleet. And it suddenly occurred to me that this year is also the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the bones of St Magnus within the pillar of the choir. So that isn't cause for a bit of a newspaper article. I don't know what is. So I'm going to try and find out the exact date that they were found and maybe work something around that. So a nice anniversary in amongst all the others. So coming into the 20th century, there was an agreement reached in 1929 that St Magnus Cathedral should be a church for everybody. And it was declared a non-denominational building. Any Christian denomination were entitled to use it, but whichever was the prevailing denomination in Scotland would be entitled to use it as a parish church. So it's a parish church for the Church of Scotland, but any other denomination is entitled to use it, and they do. They use it for weddings, they use it for funerals, they use it for special services. And 2 years ago, during the year of Magnus 900, there was a big, full-on Catholic Mass. So in practice as well as in theory, it does serve that function. There was a big event in 1987 when the west window was put in, this image that you see here, and that was to commemorate the 850th anniversary of the building of the cathedral. And it was quite a big event in the islands. Now, prior to that, in the 1970s, there had been a little bit of a fright. Cathedral custodian Albert Thompson, some of you may remember, discovered through his own surveying that the cathedral was on the move, that it was actually shifting, that it was leaning towards the west. The weight of the tower and various mismatched joins meant that the whole building was leaning. And because of his eagle eye, a huge project was launched and a massive fundraiser to save St Magnus from falling into Broad Street, effectively. And it took about 3 or 4 years. The nave was closed off and a lot of remedial work was done to keep it safe. And it is safe, there's no doubt about that now. It's very carefully monitored and it's definitely not moving. And I'm going to add that for the benefit of our new stonemason. It's not moving, you're all right. You're okay. In more modern times, we all know it as a place, not just as a church, but as a concert venue. It's one of the principal venues for the St Magnus Festival, and lots of other musical and theatrical events take place there. It's an art gallery. We've had various exhibitions of artwork in there. And the college graduation is held there too. Many of you will have graduated there or seen people graduating. And it is, by some margin, the biggest visitor attraction in Orkney, no matter what anyone else tells you. Last year we had over 200,000 visitors. And that's the ones we managed to count. So we're way up there in terms of the numbers. So 2 years ago we did the year of Magnus 900. Various things happened in the cathedral, fairly low-key, but we hope fairly effective, to draw attention to the area where the shrine would have been and to remind people that the building was built for this person, for this man, for Magnus. So that really pretty much brings me to the end of my blethering. So a very brief history, but of course I work there all the time, so if any of you want to come in, have a chat, look at things, have a walk around, I'm very, happy for anybody to do that at any time. So even if you don't get involved in this project, come and see the building. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming tonight. This is a really exciting project that we're really glad you all want to get involved in, because we've been, as Fran and Heidi said, we've been itching to get started with this for a couple of years now. I'm Antonia Thomas. I'm one of the archaeology lecturers at the Archaeology Institute up the road at the college. And one of my interests in archaeology is to do with graffiti and things like this. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight about graffiti more generally in archaeology, why it's interesting, why we should study it, and then going to touch upon briefly some other projects that have happened across the country that have looked at similar material, before looking at the sort of things we might find during this project and talking a little bit about what we're going to do in the training workshops, which I hope some of you have signed up for, and the way we're going to look at these graffiti and record them. So, first of all, I just want to kind of think really, when you think of graffiti, what tends to come to mind? You probably think of it as something that's quite negative. It doesn't immediately kind of think, oh great, graffiti, especially in the context of a beautiful old building like St Magnus Cathedral. And to start with, it seems like there's a bit of a mismatch between talking about graffiti and talking about a fine old building like that. Because we tend to think of graffiti as something that's vandalism. We tend to think of it as something that's very, very negative. As this sign from the Ring of Brodgar says, please do not graffiti or mark the stones. But of course, that's not the whole picture. Because if it was, we wouldn't be left with some actually quite fantastic graffiti from through the centuries. And this is just one snapshot of some of the many carvings at the Ring of Brodgar, J. Isbister, 1881. Because of course graffiti is actually also a very important historical record. And whilst we wouldn't condone people maybe making their mark on Brodgar now, we're rather glad that they did it then, because it's actually a really nice part of the history, the biography of these sites. So we can think of graffiti as a really important historical record. And there's a good example here, of course, William Mounsley's carvings at the Dwarfy Stone in Hoy. I spent 2 nights and so learnt patience in Arabic script, of course, Star of David, and his backwards name in Latin. And there have been quite a lot of projects. Certainly over the last few decades, graffiti as historical record has really increased in both public awareness of its importance, but also as something to be studied academically by archaeologists, historians, sociologists, and a whole range of other people. And some really important recent projects have been, a good example here, at Kilmainham Jail in Dublin, the graffiti of the political prisoners who were interned there. And much of this in pencil and in pen on the plaster walls is actually very, very fragile. And there's actually a kind of irony here which we come across in graffiti studies, that it's often the more recent graffiti actually that is at most vulnerable to being lost through erosion and through wear. Actually, it's quite often the older graffiti, the Victorian and then back, that is, it was carved in with quite a lot of effort and it's not going anywhere. But it's often the more recent stuff, this early 20th century, that it's actually quite vulnerable. Other recent high-profile projects on graffiti include these from Richmond Castle in North Yorkshire. And this is where conscientious objectors were imprisoned during the First World War huge numbers of men who refused to fight in the First World War and who were interned there. And some of them are incredibly poignant. There's poems, there's pictures, there's letters, there's passages from the Bible, there's all sorts of incredible pieces of writing on the walls there, including things like this. You might just as well try to dry a floor by throwing water on it as try to end this war by fighting. And this graffiti in Richmond Castle was very much at risk of being lost altogether, of just wearing away and then just being gone, this hugely important piece of history. And English Heritage got some money and did a very large project on this, and they're still recording it. So I think we'd all agree that this is a very important thing to do. And this form of protest is something that's really characterised graffiti studies in archaeology. And we might sort of extend it to some things that are a bit more recent, that maybe then start to make us challenge our values, if you like, about what we consider important or not in terms of graffiti as heritage. So what is clear, of course, is that graffiti isn't just one thing, and you can start to kind of break down what you think about it and whether it's good or bad, because clearly there's a lot of different contexts, settings, media, and intentions behind different types of graffiti. Archaeologically, of course, they're all very interesting, but they're not maybe what we'd all think of as worthy of an archaeological study. But to think about graffiti in archaeology and why it's important, we could look no better place really than Maze Howe, which in a way is the first sort of graffiti. And when the runic inscriptions inside Maze Howe were first publicised to the wider world after its opening by James Farrow, Daniel Wilson in his Prehistoric Annals of Scotland described these carvings as mere wall scratchings, the Norse equivalents of the old graffiti of Pompeii. And he wasn't, of course, dismissing it. Norse scholars from across Europe became very excited when these were first found. But it does kind of strike at the heart of that. It makes us challenge what we think in terms of our values about what is good or bad. Because what we now consider as the finest assemblage finest runic assemblage outside of Scandinavia was once too just graffiti. And one of the ways in which the graffiti in Maze Howe is important, of course, apart from their value about what they tell us about the Norse period and their intrinsic value in that way, is the fact that they highlight that Maze Howe is a building that has had a very, very, very long and varied history indeed. That although it wasn't in use for a long time in that history, during those thousands of years, that its biography was punctuated by points in time where it became used and appreciated in one way or another by different people. And it just lets us look at those long histories of buildings and the way different people have interacted with them. Because graffiti of all sorts, whether it's the Maze Howe dragon or whether it's somebody spraying on a street corner in a way that we might not really appreciate, it's really all about marking one's place in time and making one's mark. And what better thing can you really study as an archaeologist if you're interested in people and identity? So to think about these long histories of buildings, that we don't have that many kind of buildings like Maze Howe maybe, but if you think about most places, most towns and cities, what sort of buildings do you have that are still in use, that have been used for hundreds and hundreds of years? And of course, in most places, it's not Neolithic tombs, it's churches. normally the oldest buildings you find that are still in use. And in recognition of that fact, there have been several quite high-profile projects, mainly in England, on medieval graffiti and graffiti in churches. And these were started off in Norfolk, and then there's been a kind of knock-on effect where pretty much most counties in England have got a kind of volunteer-led graffiti survey project going. Very much led by the work of Matthew Champion on medieval graffiti and the work in Norfolk. And quite a lot of the large cathedrals as well, Canterbury, Norwich, Lincoln, have all had these projects as well. To my mind, I haven't been able to verify this, so somebody might know, I don't think there's any project like this, and like what we want to do with the St Magnus Graffiti project in Scotland. I think this is the first. There has been archaeological recording graffiti at lots of sites, but I think this is the first big community-led archaeology project looking at graffiti in this sort of setting, which is quite exciting. And of course, there's, in terms of cathedral context, as Fran said, there's very obvious reasons for that, whereas when there's only Kirkwall and Glasgow cathedrals that survived the Reformation. So what sort of things have they been finding? Well, the sort of things they've been finding south are absolutely extraordinary in these surveys. And you would think that everyone knew. This is always an assumption in archaeology. You think everyone knows what's there. So you think if you see something, somebody would have known about that. And it's very rarely the case. And often just through looking, you find stuff that people have never seen before. So that's the really exciting thing about this project, is that if you do the training and become a volunteer, you're quite likely to find something that nobody has ever seen before. And that's just fantastic. In these church surveys south, they've found some quite extraordinary things. Musical notation, musical scripts, and various drawings. Crosses, of course, you'd kind of expect that. Very legitimate forms of mark making made by pilgrims visiting churches, and quite an expected thing to find. Ships, that if you can see very well on the left-hand side, ship carving there, and on the right, a windmill. Bear in mind this is in Lincoln Cathedral. We're less likely to find a carving of a kind of that sort of windmill maybe here.
We both just said turbines.
Yeah. And in terms of, but ship graffiti, very much a typical form of sort of graffiti getting these sort of contexts. And certainly within St Magnus, there are at least a pencil drawing of a ship. And there could well be carvings, so let's see. So, because of all these other projects, there's certainly, and because of this kind of critical mass that's been built up in academic studies of graffiti of all periods in archaeology, it's certainly the right time to do this. It's a very important project. And it's great to hear Fran talk about the rich history and biography of the building itself and the things we might expect to find from that. So, what can we expect to find in the cathedral during a survey? Well, there's lots of things we know about, and there's lots of carvings which have been a feature of the tours for many, many years. But they've never really been studied systematically. Albert Thompson, who former custodian who Fran mentioned, did do a lot of work on the Mason's marks and indeed wrote a paper about it for the Proceedings of the Orkney Antiquarian Society. And there have been various other studies of different elements, but it's never been studied in that whole systematic manner. But Mason's marks, of course, a very important form of marking. Not graffiti as such, a kind of different form of mark, but still a very important part of the history of the building. And some other examples there. And those of you who are familiar with the Ness of Brodgar and its carvings you might think, oh, that one on the left looks rather like a Brodgar butterfly. And you kind of get a sense of that wonderful kind of continuity of different sorts of mark making across the ages. Hopefully we will find some more of these. This is daisy wheel compass drawn design that's just above the tomb of the Papley family in the nave. And these sort of compass drawn designs are very, very common in these sort of contexts. And they're common in lots of different periods actually, in medieval and post-medieval buildings. You can see that this is actually one of the farm buildings at Holland and Pappy. And you can see that there's some there. Different setting, probably very different intention, or perhaps not, behind them. And they're so common, these sort of compass-drawn designs, that they just find them constantly in these church surveys in Norfolk and Lincolnshire and everywhere else. Quite often called daisy wheels for obvious reasons, and they're really rather lovely. And they've been interpreted as apotropaic markings, lovely word there, kind of good cryptic crossword solution sort of word, that means warding off evil, a sort of ritual mark to kind of confuse kind of any evil spirits because of their sort of complexity. But extremely common, but we've only got one of those known in the cathedral? No. So that would be a lovely thing to find, some more of these. But so common are they that you can't see very well on that right-hand slide, but there's actually a whole typology of the different ones you can get. There's a whole kind of range. But by far and away, the most common sort of marking in the cathedral is name and date graffiti of all periods. And you see that one there, is that 1884 or 1864, something like that on the left. And you see it sort of overlying the working on the stone there, the dressing on the stone. And it hasn't really been acceptable for quite a long time. Whereas you could kind of, even at the time where people could kind of get away with it a bit at the Ring of Brodgar, the cathedral was a bit of a different sort of place, of course. So it hasn't really been acceptable to do that sort of graffiti for quite a long time. But that didn't really stop anyone. And on top of all the carved name and date graffiti, there's actually a really quite fantastic collection of penciled names in the upper corridors, on the mortar, on the plaster. And on the mortar, this pencil actually stands out quite strongly. But of course, like with the Richmond Castle graffiti, the pencil is quite vulnerable to being worn away over time. And there's a whole host of names up there. And the rather lovely thing about it, especially when you see there 1919, is that some of these names actually have their ships as well. So you can see at the top there, D. Gilmore, HMS Adventure, 10, 9, 29. So recording all of these is really, really important. All these names of people who have passed through the cathedral. And in some places, there's a whole layering of names on top of each other, whereas those previous names appear to be people from outside. They've come off a ship, maybe. These are more local names. You've got T. Gray and A. Bruce from South Romsey. But in amongst names from outside as well. So W. Keir from Falkirk. And it's hard to see on this slide, but just over the top of that is D. Work and Mark there. And he was one of the cathedral masons. And of course, there's a few more spurious ones as well. And Hugh Williams reported on this one. And I noticed that in the Scotsman, they'd sort of kind of taken some of his words but hadn't quite got the joke. So they said something like, somebody had carved Leif Erikson, but the experts are not sure whether it's serious or not. They seem to have just slightly missed what was being said. But Leif Erikson, 1156, so that's quite good. But in terms of that kind of Norse angle there, I mean, it's all really quite exciting. And it's quite nice to think how people kind of made their mark and made that connection with the space, even if it's this sort of thing. And these aren't St Magnus at all, of course. These are from Nidaros in Trondheim. These are pictures of Raggies, and I think probably quite a few of you were here for her talk a while ago, the last talk. So it would be really exciting, of course, given the connections between the two places, if there were some runic inscriptions we might find in St Magnus Cathedral. I think it's probably very unlikely, but it would be really fantastic. So, how can you get involved? And how can you help record this fantastic visitor's book, if you like, of the cathedral over the centuries? Have people signed up? Quick show of hands, has anyone signed up? People getting booked? Wow, okay, that's great. And so hopefully we'll be seeing you over the next few weeks to do some training. You have to attend the workshop. You know that already and you've signed up, that's great. It's going to involve several elements. It's going to be training in looking at the graffiti, getting your eye in really, looking at the stonework, how to use the lights and how to take the photos and how to really look and what we want you to record. It's also going to be a health and safety induction because that of course is very, very important, not least of which in a building like St Magnus Cathedral. And so you have to do this, and it's great that loads of you are. We realised that the workshops got booked up very quickly, so if those of you who weren't able to get on one of those 3 workshops, if you let Haley know, we can, we've got a standby list, and we might be able to arrange another training if there's demand for it. So that's something to think about. There's a Facebook page that. Any link to that? Can you find it? Do you have to?
Not yet. What we're going to do with the Facebook page is, as people go through the training, we're going to bring you into the group. So if you're on Facebook, one of the ideas and the concerns we have with the project is, as we'll talk about in a second, you're going to probably be working in quite small groups when you've actually had your training, because obviously the cathedral's a working building, there's things going on there, there's people in the summer, there'll be other people in the building, as Fran said, it's very busy. So we don't want people to get isolated away from the project. So we wanted a space where people could kind of check ins, anything that they've found, any sort of good advice they've got. So you will never be working on your own in there. That's one of the safety processes that we'll be running through. You'll always be working as part of a pair, and we'll work on that with the training with you. But the Facebook page is somewhere where we can have a bit of a virtual community. So if you don't see the people that are on your training course again for a few weeks, you can still talk to each other in Facebook, basically. And it's just a way. So it's not a private group. Well, it will be a private group for people who've been trained, and then within there we can kind of share ideas or anything that's come up, or any sort of good advice.
Okay, so we're got quite an ambitious plan to do volunteer-led. If anyone wants at the end to come and have a look at some of these slides, because they're not actually coming up very well at all on the screen, but you can very welcome to come and have a look on the computer. It's quite an ambitious project to do a volunteer-led survey of a building the size of St Magnus Cathedral. And one of the first things we had to think about when planning this project was how on earth to do it logistically. Because archaeology, in a way, archaeological recording is a lot about data management. We think that every single bit of graffiti needs to be cross-referenced with the photo we take of it, and we need to know exactly where it is in the cathedral. So every single bit of graffiti is going to have its own number that links to paperwork, photos, etc., so we can find it again. Because you might think as you do the survey that you take a photo of something and you know where it is, But 6 months later, when those photos are looked at again, or we come to sort of write it all up, you haven't got a chance of finding it again. And bits of stone tend to look all the same after a while. So one of the first things we did is we've got a number up the whole of the cathedral, the 3 floors, the 3 levels, and every area's got its own number. So we've got P1, P2, and that'll be like pillar 1, pillar 2, etc. So you'll be assigned a certain area, and we're going to cross-reference all the records against it so we can find the markings again. We have these sheets, bespoke sort of record sheets that this will all happen in the training. So you'll have a look at this, where we'll record the material, where it is, the size of it, do a quick sketch, and locate it and describe it. And this is what we'll go over. And you'll all get, if you complete the training, you'll get a volunteer handbook which explains everything as well. And this is some of the paperwork we'll do. But the primary method of recording will be photography. And you don't have to be an amazing photographer at all. It'd be great if there are some people who are really good photographers who want to do it. That would be fantastic. But that is not a prerequisite. And in fact, nothing is a prerequisite, really. You're all welcome to do the training. You're trained in everything you need to know. The only thing you need to think about is about physical fitness and ability, maybe to stand up for periods of time or to get into the narrow spaces in the cathedral, things like that. But it's certainly open to everybody. And we can always go back and take more photos. That's easy. So, very happy to talk to anybody about the sort of methodology we're going to use during the project, or if you've got any questions about what we're doing and why we're doing it, or about the cathedral more generally, they would be better directed towards Fran. But very happy to talk about the archaeological side of things and what to expect from the training and from the project more generally. So please, 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 this is the chance to ask lots of questions. And also lurking at the back there, just seen Sean Bell, who's a project officer from Orkney Research Centre for the Archaeology Wave. Sean, he will be at the training workshops as well. So he'll be helping train you. So please fire on with your questions if you have any. Everybody, don't sit there in stunned silence.
We'll put the lights on so that it's got a bit more on the side. So it's going to look a bit brighter all of a sudden. Brace yourself.
There's funding for a year, and so that will be until November, isn't it? When it's all the projects start. It's the calendar year, really.
Yeah, it's technically until December. But one of the things that we've done in terms of the funding from Heritage Lottery Fund, so we've got £12,000 for this project. 10,000 has come from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and 2,000 is coming from the Archaeological Society itself. But in many ways, we're spending all the money at the front. So we're buying the equipment, we're obviously paying for the time of people like Antonia to kind of help us get the process ready and to do the workshops. Once we actually get the process running, I mean, we clearly need to report back to the Heritage Lottery Fund about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and certainly towards the end of this calendar year they'll expect us to do that. But to be honest, once we've got the equipment and we've got people trained, then they're not going to take the equipment off us in January, so it will be ours to continue. But we really do want to get to the point where we can feel that we've done as good a job as we could do in the period. So we're aiming on a year, but obviously if we feel we need to do more, then we can do that. And obviously the really exciting thing is once we've got a pool of volunteer people trained and the equipment, we don't necessarily have to stop where we are, really.
How do you intend to pull the whole thing together at the end? Will they publish the booklet form, publish it in a manuscript?
Yes, good question, and I forgot to say that. I'm going to make a pamphlet, very much, that visitors to the cathedral can use. And part of it is kind of open-ended, really, because it depends on what we find. and also what the next stage will be, because there'll probably be hundreds of markings, different types, so they need to be contextualised and understood, interpreted, discussed. A book would be lovely. I think that would be, it could be a really beautiful, visually pleasing sort of book, which would be really nice, and certainly a website. They would be next stages, and it would be very much maybe seeing how we get on in this year and then applying for more money and doing a bigger next stage. But there'll certainly be a kind of booklet that will be of use to visitors to the cathedral.
Will you be including colour in your one?
What in the publications?
No, in the bit of colour just on the stones.
Well, that's a good question actually, because it wouldn't really fall under a graffiti. But you'd mean it as in original paint on
Yes.
original plaster and that sort of thing. It wouldn't really. It would kind of. It's sort of parallel to what we're doing in a way, but it wouldn't be the main focus. Certainly when people come and record in a certain area, say it's a pillar or an area of walling, there's a place on the record sheet to say any other sort of features, and they could mention something like that. But it would be, I think it's always very easy to, I find it very easy to get drawn into just one very small area, and I could just get completely obsessed with one small area of stonework for days. But that sort of goes with the territory, I suppose. But it'd be keeping that sort of focus on the carvings and the sort of graffiti. But it's a very good question, because how do we define those sort of marks, and what is important is a bit kind of, yeah.
How do you propose to communicate what you're finding with the wider interested community? The Facebook page for the people doing the work.
Yeah.
Do the rest of us have to wait for the book?
No, not at all. There will be regular updates on the UHI Archaeology Institute blog, if you've seen that. There's the Archaeology Institute has got a WordPress blog which has regular updates on all the projects that are run by the Archaeology Institute, and that'll be one of them. And then again, we'll have to see how we go. It would be very nice to do seeing how we get on over the next few months, because there'll probably be the next few months, I imagine, will be quite busy, and we'll find quite a lot, and then it'll probably slow down over the summer, because the cathedral will be in much more use, it'll be more difficult, and people are busier in the summer. So, and then it'll maybe pick up again in the autumn, winter. So it'll depend on what we find as well, and I think maybe, well, we'll certainly do another talk and show some of the findings maybe next.
Yeah, I mean, we've also had interest from Radio Orkney about possibly sort of following this as a story through. We'll have to obviously see how that goes. And one of the things we'll need to be a bit careful about is, as volunteers, if you find something absolutely fascinating, not necessarily sharing that straight away. So there will have to be an agreement from people that, you know, if you find that really rare thing, that the first we found of that is not when it's on social media. We'll need to have an understanding that if you're part of the project, then you are reporting into the project. But obviously, if we do find something that is, you know, absolutely astonishing, it would be really good for us, as Antonia says, we'll be getting that out. We don't want this to launch with all this publicity and then go very quiet, because there certainly will be a lot of interest. There obviously is a lot of interest, and as a society and at the Institute, we've had a lot of interest from people who maybe aren't even in Orkney. We had somebody who was absolutely desperate to come over from South Africa to the training, and only literally a week ago had to say she couldn't come because she couldn't afford the $1,600 South African dollars to get over here, but otherwise she was going to come, and she'd been adamant she was going to come. So there is a huge amount of interest, and we don't want it to just dissipate. So there'll be a sense of, you know, regular updates from the project as we go through.
We've got all the equipment. We've got two equipment packs of cameras and LED lights. Again, we'll go over all this in the training workshops, but we use a raking light survey to photograph the carvings, and then there's all the record sheets, the pro forma record sheets, which we printed out ready to use, but we'll go over all this in the training.
And you don't have to bring any equipment with you?
No.
It's all been provided and you'll be trained in using it.
Yeah.
If you find any graffiti that's associated with tombstone or something personal, would you need to get permission of existing relatives or somebody else in order to publish? I'm just thinking if you find something that's on tombstone,
Well, I think they're so long away in time, aren't they?
I mean, they're also very, tombstones themselves are very publicly on
Yeah,
display.
yeah, so it's not.
And photographs of the tombstones inside the cathedral all over the internet already. I think that ship has sailed.
But it does raise interesting questions, because obviously
Yeah.
a lot of the people who wrote their name in pencil, their relatives will be able to know who they are very easily.
Some of them
And
are
there's-
still alive.
Some of them are still alive.
We having a word.
And there were lots of pictures that I kind of was thinking about putting up, and I didn't. Because at first I didn't want to kind of take away from the excitement when you see them on one of Fran's tours during the training workshops. But also, when you show pictures of graffiti, you always have to think, shall I actually show this? And there's one part of the cathedral where there's a really nice cluster of female names. And this is quite interesting, because actually, normally, and there's no assumptions inherent in what I'm saying, it's normally men who tend to make their mark in graffiti. So it's quite interesting to see a little cluster of female names. And and they're Orcadian names, very much Orkney names. And it's almost like a school trip or something like that. There's a cluster there, and there's a nice story there, and certainly they're going to be traceable people. So there is a kind of that element to it as well, which is quite interesting. A next stage, just for talk about archives and things, is that for some people who might not be fully physically able or can't commit in one way or another to maybe the survey work of the project, there may well be, as a next stage, possibilities of getting involved with archive work. There's a rich archival history to do with the restoration work at the cathedral, to do with phasing, and also to do with the masons' marks and things like that, which would be fantastic if people want to get involved with that side of it as well. Sorry, I know you've been very patient with that. Well, if you sign up for the training workshops, we hope that that is because you want to commit as a volunteer. It's not just because it's bespoke a training workshop specific to being a volunteer in this project. So although it is, you could use those skills elsewhere, really it's to become a volunteer. There's going to be there's 2 sets of equipment, 2 sets of cameras, so we can have 2 teams working side by side. We want teams of maybe 2, maybe 3. So we can kind of have 4 of you, and that would be a couple of sessions in the morning, a couple in the afternoon, 2-hour slots. So that's not too much, I hope, and you could kind of sign up for those. We've got a sign-up process where you can do it remotely, you can do it online, sign up to the time slots. No, that's the volunteer slots. Everybody, if you want to be a volunteer in the cathedral to do the survey, you'll have to sign up to the slots. Once you've been inducted in the training workshop, you'll have to sign up to the volunteer slots. You can't just turn up at the cathedral whenever you want and do it, because of course it's a working building, and we need to know who's going to be there then for a whole host of reasons, really. So
We're still, we're just testing the signing up process just today, to be sure that it will work, because one of the things as well we needed to take account of is, if we've got, say, I don't know, a month ahead of time slots, obviously things can happen, and we may suddenly discover that we can't use the cathedral for a morning that we've got volunteers signed up for, because possibly a funeral or something will need to come in at short notice. So it's possible as a volunteer you may actually be told that you can't be in when you want to be in. So we're just testing the cancellation process and so on, because obviously what we don't want to do, particularly if you're travelling in from journey in and then discover that you can't do your time slot. So you'll need to bear with us a little bit while we get that working. Like I say, we've just been testing that today, and it seems to work okay, but we'll want to just be certain with the first group. And I think if your question was, do you have to sign up to do a minimum number of volunteer sessions, the answer is no, you don't, but we would really hope that everybody who volunteers, does a good amount, whatever that is, over a period of time. And there will be some people who will obviously want to do it a lot, and that will be brilliant. And there'll be people who maybe because they're working or they're busy at the weekend won't be able to do as much as they would like. But the idea will be, I think it'd be good to keep your hand in to, not lose the skills, and then to look ahead in this online booking system and find somewhere to come in and do it through that. But you won't get like a nasty email if you've not turned up or anything like that. Well, we haven't got that written into the process yet. But if nobody comes, we might. But no, I think we're pretty confident. We've got 54 people signed up for the training sessions. That's 3 lots of 18. And I think between that, we hope very much that we will get a lot of good people who come a lot, and then people who will come in and out. But it would be really good to do a session on a fairly regular basis, because I think you're right, it's about getting your eye in and knowing what you're looking for, and that kind of practice will be really good for people.
Have you given any thought to doing a talk on this at the Science Festival in September?
Not yet, but I think that's a very good idea.
Again, it depends what's found, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we really want this to be community owned and driven, and that's why it's really great that we're able to work with professional archaeologists like Antonia and volunteers like us, and kind of keep the whole thing kind of going on that way, really. So I think that would be a really good idea. If we've got something to say by then, and I'm sure we will, maybe we need to have a chat with the Science Festival about maybe getting us a slot. That'd be good.
Maybe I'm missing something there.
Sorry, Sarah.
No, go on. We've been talking about having volunteer workshops and so on. How soon will we get cracking after the volunteering bit? I'm not special at the moment. So, but from April, might be a bit restricted. So.
No, I mean, as soon as you've been trained up and inducted, you'll be pretty much ready to go. The restriction is on the use of the cathedral, so I think we were looking at the first week in February, having the first lot of people in. Yeah. And there's potentially 8 slots a day, so there could be 40, and so obviously Sunday is out, but kind of, so there could be 48 sessions a week, so there's kind of, there could be a lot done. You could do a lot in that time, and it'll probably be quite slow to start with as everyone gets used to it and kind of working out whether, or is that a bit of tooling on a stone, or is that actually a deliberate mark and that sort of thing. But I think it'll pick up pace and everyone will be raring to go. We're going to start with the ground floor first of all, and that will be the first stage. A few reasons for that. Kind of logistically, it's a lot safer. It's a lot more open working environment, and it's a lot of the markings are a lot clearer and easier to record. The pencil markings, the name and date pencil markings, those ones are in the upper corridors. It's a lot more restricted space, and actually more complicated to record when there's a whole mass of names and dates on top of each other. So that will be a next level, both physically and in terms of the project as well. So we're going to start off on the ground floor and take that as it goes.
So is there a potential to open it up to, obviously this is focusing on St Magnus Cathedral, open it up across Orkney, because there's obviously a lot of graffiti across the mainland on St Magnus and Wolverstone, and I know someone's been looking at graffiti in Westry as well.
Yeah.
So it'd be a really interesting way to see if
definitely.
people are autographing
Yeah,
their way around.
Definitely. I mean, I've been doing a lot of survey work on certainly the Neolithic sites and Iron Age sites that have got graffiti. But the interesting thing about those is that they get added to all the time. And so there's a real scope for community projects because it's not a static thing. People are constantly adding to them. And as I alluded to earlier, although we consider that as vandalism now, it's still important to record things as they're happening into the future, even if we agree with them. So I think there's a big scope for a wider community project where people do record things and update those records. Yeah. And you could even think of it, it's similar in a way to kind of community-led rock art projects where people have, there's even apps, where we could get funding developing a graffiti app or something, where people can record all this stuff and then upload it to the Historic Environment Record. And certainly all these records will be uploaded to the National Monuments Record Service, so there'll be a resource ultimately for researchers in the future to use as much as for the community to use and understand now.
I take it that all the surveying is going to be done on the floor rather than
Yes.
using.
Our lovely safety officer, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely.
Don't worry, Anna, we've got some really good risk assessments.
We have.
We're absolutely fine. We're solid on risk assessment.
There's no ladders, there's not going to be any ladders.
No ladders, no one's going up ladders. Nobody's standing on chairs. If they are, they get a big telling off from me.
And we would certainly expect everything to be within, wouldn't expect it to be out of that height really anyway.
It'll come on exterior, is it?
Yes, yeah. And that's when lighting will be really quite crucial and quite important. But yes, the exterior as well. Yeah. Be one for that, be one for the winter months maybe as well. So you can actually use light, because as soon as you get that kind of very bright but diffuse kind of summer light, it'll be very hard to see anything outside of it.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
And I've got examples of the recording sheets and things we're going to use if anyone wants to have a look at those, but of course we will go over those in training. So. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about that.
Right, well what we'll do then is just a little bit on what's going to happen next. So if you've signed up for one of the training workshops, the first one of which is on Saturday, 1 till 5 in the cathedral, and thanks very much to Fran for facilitating that. So basically when you come along to the workshop, there's going to be 18 on each group. All of the training sessions are now full, so if for any reason you are on a training session and you can't make it, including on the morning itself of the training, if you basically either let me know, which is the email that you will have had, comes to me, or drop it back in, you can cancel on the Eventbrite website. I have got waiting lists, so I can then phone somebody on the list and see if they can get there, so that we can get people in. So we do have a small waiting list, but we do have a waiting list. So when you actually get to the training workshop, it's basically going to be in 3 parts. There's going to be kind of running through the process, which is really what Antonia's going to be showing us, which is about the use of the cameras, what to look at, how to record, and so on and so forth. And then you're also going to have, we're going to be working in 3 groups of 6, this is the theory. There's also going to be a full health and safety briefing and a kind of a tour around the cathedral, so you get a sense of the cathedral and the bits that maybe you haven't seen, and then also be a tour of the upper levels. So you will see it in 3 parts. The training itself is going to basically be a 3-part training. And the reason why we've restricted it to 18 through each course is that we're only allowed to have 6 at a time in the upper levels. So basically that's 3 lots of 6. So each of you will go up at 1 part in that training course. It's 1 till 5. Now I know that obviously people will have commitments, but we would really appreciate it if people can stay pretty much for the whole course. Because one of the things in terms of managing the health and safety on this project is, and in terms of managing insurance, because we'll obviously need to make sure that it's insured as well, is that we will be able to say hand on heart that everybody attended the training and everybody had the full briefing when they did the tour round. If for whatever reason you don't physically want to do the upper level tour, or you're not physically capable of doing the upper level tour, that's totally fine. Then we'll just make a note to say that you didn't do that. But obviously that then does mean that when it comes to doing the upper level elements, then you won't be able to do that bit of recording. So it's just about being sensible about how we work in that building, because obviously, as Alan quite rightly raises the point, there are elements in that building which are quite risky, and the last thing that we want to do is to have anybody injured as a result of this project. So it's going to be very carefully managed, and it is why we will be a little bit, maybe, appropriately sensible about saying you have to do the training, and also we are going to be saying that when you come to do the recording, we're not going to have anybody working on their own. So if you're part of the recording, you will either come in a pair or you could be 3 people. But if you're, and again, you'll be able to see that when you book on. You don't have to book on with somebody you know. Hopefully we'll all kind of get to know each other through this project, but you might book on with somebody you don't know, that's fine. But if when you actually arrive and there isn't anybody there to do with it, we will unfortunately be having to say if there's nobody for you to work with, then you can't work in the cathedral on your own. And again, it's a simple health and safety, not lone working. Because whilst there will always be custodian staff or curatorial staff or cathedral staff, they also have their job to do. So when you're working in the cathedral, you really will have to be quite self-contained and quite self-managed. So that's part of what the training is for, is to take us all through that process. So it's best to be upfront and to say these are the expectations of the volunteers that are going to be in it. So if you're not on the training courses, but you would like to be on the training courses, so if you want to go on the waiting list or onto a possible 4th date, then just see me at the end and I can take a note of your details. So we have identified a date for a 4th training course, but we obviously won't be able to run it unless we've got like a reasonably good number of people on. And I think at the moment we've got 2 or 3 people waiting. So the date was the 23rd of February. So that's the date we've got penciled in for the 4th, not penciled in on the wall, penciled in for the 4th training course. But we will only run that if we've kind of got probably more than about 8 or 9 people on the course, just because it's obviously going to cost us to run it. So if you want to go on that or on a waiting list for any of the others, just see me at the end and we'll happily add you on. So I hope that's okay with everybody. Anybody got any questions on